filter. They can filter. Welcome. My name is Mina Bose. I'm the director of the Peter S. Kalikow Center for the Study of the American Presidency at Hofstra, and it's my pleasure to welcome you today to our Creating Images of the American Presidency from Campaigns to the White House panel. We'll begin the panel with a few words from Hofstra University President Stuart Rabinowitz.
Thank you. You know they understand my role because they didn't give me a seat. I have nothing substantive to say whatsoever, except I'm just here to welcome everybody and tell you how thrilled I am that we're having this event. First of all, to partner with a magazine of the quality and the reputation and credibility, and if you will, image of Vanity Fair is a pleasure for us. And this is, I think, our first joint enterprise of this nature. We were going to have this before, but coming from Manhattan, there was a little snow and they all canceled that the first day. Remember that? We were here, but they didn't come out from Manhattan. But as you know, this is another program sponsored by us. On our part, it's the Kalikow Center on the Study of the American Presidency, and that center has become a vital part of what Hofstra's scholarly reputation is and will be. And you know, as you know, we've done conferences on every president, starting with FDR. Those conferences have been hailed as the perfect combination between academic analysis and public policy issues and decision makers on the ground and so on. And we established the Presidential Center thanks to the generosity of Peter Kalikow, and we were lucky enough to host a presidential debate in 2008. The last debate, the final debate before the presidential election, and it was a great event for the university because it was a great event for our students. And we designed educational programs for our students around it, and we continue to do that after the election in what we call Define 09, which is a similar kind of presentation of the major issues facing the new administration. And because this was so educational for our students and inspired them to participate in the process, the voting process. In fact, more than 7,000 of our students registered to vote in the 2008 election, in large part, I think, because of the excitement of hosting the debate. We are applying for the debate once again in 2012. But this program is every bit as important as any of our others, and it puts the very important issue of what image the president as a candidate and as a leader is trying to project, how the president tries to project and why those images, and whether he, and so far there's no she, but whether he has been successful in terms of public opinion and projecting that image. So I will let the experts talk and just welcome everybody and say I can't wait to hear what you have to say. Mina, thank you.
This panel, as the project itself, the Presidential Profiles book published by Vanity Fair in February, has been many months in the making. And to explain the origins of this discussion, we have Vanity Fair editor of creative development, David Friend, here to say a few words. David is a longtime editor at Vanity Fair, previously was director of photography at Life magazine. He has won Emmy and Peabody Awards for his work as executive producer of 9/11, the CBS documentary that aired in 140 countries. David, thank you.
Thank you, Mina. Thank you for having us all here. I'll keep it very brief because it's the panelists that you've come here to see and hear. This event today emerged from talks with Bernie Firestone, the esteemed Hofstra dean, and I got to know Bernie through Vanity Fair contributing editor Douglas Brinkley, himself a presidential historian. And because of the Kalikow Center's history and study of the presidency, and because my daughter, Molly, who's here, a Hofstra senior, kept telling me how riveted she was by the debates here, I called Bernie when Abrams Books was about to publish the new book. You see some images up here by Mark Summers directly to my left. from this new book, Vanity Fair's Presidential Portraits. The book underscores Vanity Fair's consistent coverage of power and the presidency. During the Jazz Age, it was Wilson and Coolidge and Hoover. In the modern age, under Graydon Carter, the magazine has been focused on, of course, Reagan and Bush and Clinton, Bush, the second George Bush, to Obama in the modern era. So, Bernie introduced me to Mina, and together we began to plan this session as Mina had suggested many months ago. The participants are perfectly matched for the subject. Lisa Merrill is a Hofstra mainstay and an expert in political theater and something of a Vanity Fair scholar. Ed Rollins is a political legend and now part of the extended Hofstra family. Todd Purdum is a Vanity Fair contributor and the magazine's presidential expert, along with his wife, Dee Dee Myers, who was President Clinton's press secretary. The pair are considered the Nick and Nora Charles of the Washington, D.C. or D.C. scene, or as some would say, the Brad and Angelina.
If Washington is Hollywood for ugly people, that might be true in my case.
And then there's illustrator Mark Summers. Mark is Canadian, and as Mark told me, the U.S. presidency was, quote, a mild obsession since she was 12, and even then I could name all the presidents in order. Throughout his life, Mark says, he was exposed 100% to U.S. media, and it was as if the American presidency itself was a television show, and we Canadians didn't have much invested in it. By Mark's way of thinking, as I understand it, a person at a remove from a subject, and I think this is important to students, a person at a remove from a subject rather than an insider is often in a more unique position or a unique position to capture that subject's essence and substance, and often with a more discerning and critical eye. Mark notes that some of the best imitators of presidents, Walter Houston and Raymond Massey, who played Lincoln, Dan Aykroyd on Saturday Night Live, who played Nixon and Carter, Phil Hartman, who played Reagan and Clinton. Some of the great presidential satirists are themselves Canadian. Sometimes it takes an outsider to understand. And so today, it will maybe help to remember that all of our panelists are in a way insiders, but they're also looking at things from afar. Todd, it so happens, is not from Washington, but originally from the center of the country, Macomb, Illinois. Ed, an accomplished boxer as a teenager, grew up on the West Coast, and Lisa, so she says at lunch today, spends much of her time living in the 19th century. It sounds counterintuitive, but it's also often the relative outsider who has something really revealing to say. Thank you. Vanity Fair thanks you, and we thank you for having us here at Hofstra.
Thank you, David. Let me also extend my thanks to everyone at Hofstra who has helped put together this event, particularly the Hofstra Cultural Center, Kathleen Collins, and the Office of University Relations, Carla Schuster, who I know is, there you are, both of whom organized this event not once but twice, and absolutely seamlessly. And thanks to all of the students who are here today and everyone in the audience who have taken the time to join us for this discussion. If you have not seen the Vanity Fair book, Presidential Profiles, I hope you will take a look at it after the panel. We'll have copies available for purchase. This is a marvelous book. It is rich with insights of each of our nation's 43 presidents, or 44 if you count Grover Cleveland twice, and amazing illustrations by Mark Summers, who will be telling us a little bit about the origins of this project shortly. I must say, and each of the descriptions, one page, come in at under 400 words, I think David told me at lunch today. So this is really pithy summaries of each of our presidents that nicely combine tidbits of American history with serious insights into their leadership styles, their personalities, their ambitions. I thought I had read a lot about presidents, but I didn't know until I read this book that Andrew Jackson so despised paper currency that he insisted on the return trip from the White House back to Tennessee on paying for everything with gold. He wouldn't use an ironic that he is on the $20 bill today. I did not know that Gerald Ford, after he became president in 1974, continued to reside at his Virginia home for a time being and was actually photographed opening the door in the morning to collect his newspaper in his pajamas, which an image which some of you have said you recall from the news. Todd Purdum, I think some of the features that you wrote, you quoted Bill Clinton as saying, "Politics was the only track I ever wanted to run on." And that represents so well, I think, the essence of Bill Clinton, whom read biographies of him say that he, at Georgetown University as an undergraduate, was already amassing a Rolodex of names, of potential contacts. President Obama wears his ambition lightly. We'll be exploring these case studies and the broader question of presidential image today, how presidential candidates seek to represent themselves to the public, how presidents develop an image, market an image, seek to establish a perception of themselves, and how the public responds. We were speaking earlier today, John McCain, in an interview published this week, said, "I never considered myself a maverick," which seems to run against the very grain of what his 2008 campaign was about. How do presidential candidates and presidents create images, seek to design images, and how effective are they in so doing? We'll begin with short presentations by Mark Summers and Todd Purdum discussing the Presidential Profiles book and images of the presidency. We'll then turn to Professor Lisa Merrill, who will be speaking about 19th century portraits of the presidents I almost hesitate to say an earlier incarnation of Vanity Fair, certainly not the Vanity Fair we know today, but a Vanity Fair nonetheless. And then we'll wrap up the presentations with Mr. Ed Rollins from a strategist's perspective of how presidential candidates cultivate and develop successful campaign images. And as someone who oversaw Ronald Reagan's 49-state victory in 1984 is particularly well qualified to discuss that subject. We'll then have some brief discussion amongst the panelists, and then we'll open it up for audience questions. Shall we begin with you, Mark? Thank you.
Thank you for having me. I'm going to speak in non-abstract terms. I'm actually hired to portray presidents. The images you saw up there are not my regular style. Those are actually preliminary sketches for a series I was going to do. If you've ever been in a Barnes & Noble, those portraits of Barnes & Noble are by me, and that's why I get hired a lot to do presidents, is that the American public seems very comfortable seeing them in engravings, because you're exposed to portraits of presidents or on your money. So the American public seems to like engravings, or they like to see them on the side of mountains. When I get hired to do presidents, it usually falls into one of three categories. First one is to reaffirm an existing image, and that's a short list. That's the guys on the side of the mountain. And editors and publishers, they don't want you messing with that image to the point where they don't even want you showing Washington smiling. I've been trying to sell that idea for years. They don't want to see it. So when I do get hired, for example, it was the 200th anniversary of Lincoln last year, and I did a set of stamps for your government of Lincoln. And when they hire somebody like me, they still want to see the engraving look, which you're comfortable with, but when they're hiring somebody new like me, they want to see the president portrayed with a more modern vocabulary, which means that they want it more cinematic. So when I was given this assignment to do Lincoln as a log splitter, as a lawyer, then as Lincoln Douglas debates, and finally as president, I use the cinematic vocabulary, which means that you start on sort of eye level, and then to make them look more heroic, you slowly drop the camera angle down. And that tends to work. So, but when I'm hired to draw Lincoln or Teddy Roosevelt, I know what my assignment is. Don't mess with this guy. Just draw him. The second category is to reestablish a historical perspective. I don't get asked to do that too many times, but it's the only time I ever have major arguments with art directors or editors. This started back, I did a portrait for the cover of the New York Times Book Review of Nixon when he brought out his memoirs. And I did a fairly incredibly detailed engraving of him, very close up, which they ran, but the art director called up and said, we here at the New York Times think you were a little hard on Nixon. I said, the New York Times thinks I was hard on Nixon. And he said, yeah, like he looked pretty dark. I said, well, the picture I worked from is one that you ran on the front page in 1972, so he didn't think it was too hard then. This was now I think 92, maybe mid-80s. The next thing was, a week later, I did the portrait of Nancy Reagan, and they called up and said I was too nice to Nancy Reagan. And my attitude is, I said, let's just, it's just my personal opinion. How about we show everybody the exact same amount of respect so that 20 years from now, you're not bending over backwards to be fair to Nancy Reagan, because Nancy Reagan's never done anything to me, frankly. And the next category I usually hired to do is establishing a visual image. So I get hired by Time Magazine and the Wall Street Journal a fair bit, usually to do inauguration portraits. It's kind of amazing. Time Magazine will send a reporter out covering Obama for 6 months, and then 48 hours before the magazine has to be published, they realize that they're going to need a cover. I don't know why they've never thought of it, which means that like you might think there's a lot of thought put behind these images on the cover of magazines. Vanity Fair is an exception, but I'm talking usually weekly news magazines. There's no thought. It's like they come up with an idea on the way to their phone, and I usually have to fight with them because usually if it's a negative image, they haven't put any thought in it. I keep trying to tell them, if you want to do a negative comment on this person, for one thing, you called the wrong person. I can give you the names of people who are willing to do this image, but you haven't put enough thought into it. And there's one magazine in particular, I won't use it, but they keep coming after me, and they come up with the dumbest, classless ideas, and they think that maybe if a bad idea is rendered in an engraved look, it will somehow elevate the idea. I refer to it as the idea that you hire Judi Dench to sell Roach motels. And the argument I give on this one, and this is why I turn them down a lot, is that sometimes in news conference or on the news you see Obama posters dressed as Hitler, and I saw the same images of the last Bush wearing swastikas and a little mustache, and I keep telling these magazine editors, I said, does that make Obama look bad, or does it make the guy holding the poster look bad? And I said, if you have that image on your magazine, it's going to not reflect well on you, and it's not going to reflect well on me. So my attitude is, let's show everybody some respect, and try and show everybody with a little bit of class. So that's what I've tried to do on the book also. Here we go.
I'm not going to stand up because I don't really want to have that much to say. That's partly because David and I, with a half dozen of our colleagues, are responsible for the part of the book that Mark's pictures are worth 1,000 of. So I'm conscious that the words are not the really important part of this book. But all the same, it was a real challenge to try to distill into a single page, 400 words or less, the basic information about the personalities of each president. In looking up the definition and origin of the word profile, I found that it comes from the Italian verb profilare, which means to outline. And in some ways, the task in prose was the same as it was in pencil, to outline the essential qualities and characteristics of these incredibly diverse and interesting collection of people. I thought I knew quite a lot about the presidents, but thanks to the help of Vanity Fair's crack research staff and my colleagues at the magazine, I learned things I never knew about these individuals. I learned, for example, that Martin Van Buren, who'd grown up in upstate New York, the son of a tavern owner, was apparently a prodigious drinker, but one who could hold his liquor very well, while Franklin Pierce was more or less a hopeless drunk and was so despondent on leaving office that he in fact said, "There's nothing left to do but get drunk." It's not insignificantly, perhaps, his descendant. It includes the mother of the 43rd president, George W. Bush, who was born Barbara Pierce in Rye, New York. But I learned that Franklin Roosevelt was related by blood or marriage to 11 former presidents, which shows you just what an aristocratic background he had, as well as what a small country it still was in 1882 when he was born. The population was concentrated in the eastern seaboard, and of course his family had been, in the country for many, many generations, part of the original Dutch settlement in New York. I learned also the enormous gulf between popular images of some presidents and the way they actually were. Of course, we all know that Jerry Ford was a star athlete and not the bumbling Chevy Chase of popular imagination. I think it's not so well known that Dwight Eisenhower had these fierce, steely blue eyes that people found penetrating and very upsetting if they were turned against you in a way in which you felt his displeasure. It was fun for me living in Washington to have this challenge because there are really two great collections of presidential portraiture in Washington. One is in the National Portrait Gallery, which is part of the Smithsonian, and there's a collection of really distinguished paintings of every president, including a famous Gilbert Stuart full-length portrait of George Washington known as the Lansdowne portrait. There's an oddly sympathetic Norman Rockwell oil painting of Richard Nixon, in which Rockwell confessed that he went out of his way to be sympathetic and make Nixon look better on painting than he actually did in person because he sort of felt sorry for him, I think. There's a very brooding, abstract kind of picture of Jack Kennedy. There are any other number of diverse images, including the Shepard Fairey, the original Shepard Fairey collage of Obama. And the other collection of presidential portraitures is in the White House itself. And if you've ever been to the White House, you'll see that the president's portraits shift around a bit from administration to administration, sometimes depending, I think, on the partisan affiliation or the personal preferences of the incumbent of the Oval Office. But they're really quite striking. There's a wonderful John Singer Sargent portrait of Teddy Roosevelt in which he's holding a finial on a stairway. And apparently this portrait resulted from the fact that Sargent kept trying to find Roosevelt in a pose that would adequately convey all his energy and vigor and irritation. And finally, Roosevelt got so frustrated he grabbed the newel post and Sargent said, "That's it." And I think he then must have had to hold the newel post for a very long time to complete the pose. There's a famous kind of brooding portrait of JFK by Aaron Schickler that the only person who likes it or ever liked it, as near as I can tell, was Mrs. Onassis. I think most other people much preferred Jamie Wyeth's painting of Kennedy, in which he had that chestnut hair and the vigorous grin that people think of as more typical. But in some ways, this picture of Kennedy is very, very melancholy. Aaron Schickler also painted Jacqueline Kennedy's official portrait as well as Nancy Reagan's, and one can't help but think that Mrs. Reagan thought it would be a very good thing to be painted by the same person who painted Mrs. Kennedy, who after all became an iconic first lady. So if you ever do go to the White House, I urge you to look around and see these pictures. They're quite remarkable and a very interesting index into the way people work. There's one other sort of personal Vanity Fair note I guess I would make, which is that when Franklin Roosevelt died at Warm Springs, Georgia, he was actually sitting for a portrait by Madam Elizabeth Shumatoff, whose grandson, Alex Shumatoff, is our colleague at Vanity Fair and writes about environmental issues from all over the world. So for me, the challenge, it's one thing to write one page about Abraham Lincoln, who's, you know, I think more books have been written about Lincoln than any other president. I think more books have been written about the Civil War than any other American war. It's another to write a whole page about James Garfield, who died really, you know, only a few months after taking office, or some of the distinguished failures like James Buchanan. It's really hard to, you felt like you were stretching to get to a page on them sometimes. And it was a special challenge to try to write a page about Barack Obama when we knew this book would come out just barely a year into his tenure. And in fact, the piece was in galleys and really pretty much final when I was driving to North Carolina one day last fall and David called. We realized Obama had that morning won the Nobel Prize, and we had to somehow take note of that. So this is definitely a history on the fly in the case of the incumbent. And I hope that, you know, 5 or 15 or 50 years from now, we'll look back and not think that what I wrote about Obama was completely silly, but at least might have been someplace in the ballpark. So I look forward to answering questions later from you all. In the meantime, defer to my colleagues who will know much more than I do about this whole topic.
Thanks, Todd. And I should note that you wrote in here that Obama's story is unfinished. So I think you've left the door open to further assessments. Lisa.
Good afternoon. I'm taking you back to the 19th century with me, and I'll be talking about Lincoln in the little time I have with you. On July 27, 1863, at the height of the Civil War, John T. Ford, the proprietor of the very theater in which Abraham Lincoln would be assassinated a year and a half later, wrote the letter you see in front of you, behind me. Ford wrote this letter to actress Charlotte Cushman, and I found it last summer in the archives of the Library of Congress. It's never been published, and I'm good at reading that handwriting, but I've transcribed some of it for you. And Ford speculates in this letter, if the heady philosopher of the Tribune had failed at Chicago, and in place of the president we have, Lincoln, we had President Seward, what a difference our once great country would now present. As Ford knew, Cushman was a close personal friend of then Secretary of State William Henry Seward, who had lost the nomination to Lincoln at the Republican convention in Chicago that's being referred to here. But the letter you see before you attests most strongly to the acknowledged impact by one agent of popular culture, a leading theater manager, of the importance played by another, the periodical press, in shaping Lincoln's candidacy. And so today I invite you to briefly explore with me the role played by agents of popular culture, the press, illustrators, photographers, theatrical impresarios, in shaping images of Lincoln and his presidency. What's most noteworthy to me in this little quote that I shared with you is how Horace Greeley, the editor of the Tribune, and such a significant cultural figure in his own right, that he didn't even need to be named. Greeley was the heady philosopher, and so influential that he was acknowledged by his contemporaries as the architect of Lincoln's public image. And I found in this research that the purveyors of images of politicians like Lincoln in the popular press weren't just figures in the background or the cultural stage setting of the theater of war played out in Lincoln's presidency, but they served as significant actors or dramaturgs in their own right, helping to construct and frame the image of Lincoln in the popular culture of the day. And the periodical press, rather than merely reporting on political events, was acknowledged as one stage on which cultural representations of politicians were constructed, as well as mass-produced. What you see now is a Curry and Ives caricature of Lincoln with Greeley and other New York editors. Mass-produced photographs, wood engravings, caricatures of Lincoln like that in the popular periodical press served as a staging arena for the visual representations of the candidate and then President Lincoln. And like the Saturday Night Live or Colbert Report or Daily Show we were talking about earlier today, of today, in the 19th century, some of these parodic and satiric forms of popular visual culture also contributed to the way a president was seen. So in this image that you have before you, like Ford's letter, Lincoln's being ridiculed by being depicted as being shaped by Horace Greeley. Other illustrations show Greeley as a puppeteer. In this image, Greeley is the organ grinder, and Lincoln is his monkey. And the other figures that you have are the other editors of New York newspapers. So what's significant to me here is that people seeing this cartoon would know what their editors look like, as well as know and attribute to them the responsibility for framing a particular image. And the predominant message in this particular cartoon is that Lincoln, president-elect, was controlled by the then Republican, remember this is 19th century notions of Democrat and Republican, by the pro-Republican press, particularly Greeley. Now, for all the obvious advocacy or ridicule in political cartoons, actual photographs and representations based on photographic images had a significant place in the construction of Lincoln as a public persona. What you see before you is Matthew Brady's photograph of Lincoln during his first campaign. On February 27, 1860, then candidate Lincoln delivered an enormously successful speech at Cooper Union in New York. And Greeley published the text of that speech in the Tribune, along with positive accounts of Lincoln and his oratory. And many people claim that attribute that to Lincoln's success. But a few hours before that speech, just a few streets away, Lincoln sat for the photograph you see before you by Matthew Brady. And it's important to remember that at the time, photography was only 2 decades old. It's been invented in 1839. Also to note, the candidates in the 19th century didn't travel and campaign in person. So mass-produced images like this from this new technology of photography on placards affixed to buildings, distributed as carte visites, printed on ribbons, and on the covers of periodicals, functioned in Harold Holzer's terms as surrogates for the candidate. And in fact, after seeing this image of Lincoln without a beard, an 11-year-old upstate New York girl, Grace Bedell, wrote to the candidate and said that he should grow whiskers. She wrote, "You would look a great deal better. All the ladies like whiskers, and they would tease their husbands to vote for you, and then you'd be president." It's not clear if that's what ended up persuading Lincoln, but we all know the result. My colleagues on the panel and the work that they've done comes from the contemporary periodical Vanity Fair, and in the few minutes that I have left, I wanted to focus on images of Lincoln's presidency from an earlier periodical of the same name. The first Vanity Fair was a magazine that appeared in New York as a humorous weekly, not as a serious, more like Punch in England. And it was running from 1859 to 1863. The image that you see in front of you is from April 12th, 1862, cover of Vanity Fair. The editor of this publication was Philadelphian Henry Louis Stevens, and Stevens was known as an illustrator and a caricaturist. So illustrations were even more important than text in this periodical. And what you see there is a favorable illustration of Lincoln in this cover, depicting his desire for cooperation between the states. He had been constructed as the rail splitter, and each of the wood planks that you see has the name of a state, and Lincoln is trying to put the tub together. But editor Henry Louis Stevens' own pro-abolition position, apart from his work on Vanity Fair, was evident to me when I did a little more research into his own artwork from the same period. What you see here is a watercolor by Stevens of a black man reading a newspaper by candlelight in 1863. And it's important to remember that at this time, enslaved Americans were forbidden the right to learn to read or write. And so in the throes of the Civil War, that Stevens chose to construct this particular image, I think tells us a lot about him. But Vanity Fair images showed different sides of Lincoln. What you see in front of you now, September 6th, 1862, has, again, Horace Greeley as an identifiable figure playing the music, and Lincoln is a minstrel. So some of these images continued to satirize, critique, ridicule Lincoln. And they did that by ridiculing what they saw was Lincoln's dependence on Horace Greeley's strong abolitionist position. It's also to remember, my background is in performance studies and public address, that this was the age of black-faced minstrelsy performed largely by white men. And here Lincoln is depicted in 1862 as a minstrel, complaining of the monotony of dancing to H.G., that's Horace Greeley's, same old croaking tune, abolition, abolition, marching on. So in both this caricature and the earlier Curran Ives that I showed you, Lincoln as the monkey, are racialized, charged allusions, and they're coupled with messages about Lincoln's subservience to Greeley. And ways to demonize the pro-Lincoln and pro-abolition Republican press, all of which is cast in terms that drew upon the anti-theatrical prejudice of the time. Another Vanity Fair illustration, the last that I'll share with you, is of the same day as John Ford's letter that I started with, July 27th, 1863. And this depicts an encounter between Lincoln and pro-secessionist former New York City Mayor Fernando Wood, who was then serving in Congress. And Wood is leaving his meeting with Lincoln with his hat in his hands. Now, images always contain traces of and references to the cultural context out of which they come, and we've heard that about the book that we're discussing today as well. But images, the reception of images at their time can only be understood, I think, through an analysis of the larger visual and popular culture. So think about the fact that in 1862, readers of this Vanity Fair cartoon, still reeling from the horrors of the draft riot in New York, would know that much of the inflammatory anti-Lincoln, racist, anti-abolition press was covered in a paper, The New York World. At that time, it was under the directorship of the then Democratic National Committee. It had been formally operated by Fernando Wood. Wood's brother Benjamin was editor of the New York Daily News, again a different periodical than the one we know, which had been closed for abetting treason in 1861 and 1862. But what almost nobody seems to know is that their other brother, Henry Wood, was the founder of Wood and Christie's Minstrels, one of the earliest troops performing black-faced minstrelsy. So part of my argument today is that these agents of popular culture are always intermingled, and we can't look at them from one disciplinary foundation without the other. So many of the anti-Lincoln images I've seen, as you've seen today, racialized Lincoln and appealed to white supremacist viewers and readers. There were images of a black Lincoln and images like this of interracial couples used to fan fears of the threat of interracial mixing that was at the heart of some of the most inflammatory press. And this was most overt in a pamphlet and series of drawings titled Miscegenation, published in New York in 1864 during Lincoln's re-election campaign. Now, it was authored anonymously, but it has since been discovered, and I've confirmed it, that it was written by two New York World reporters, George Wakeman and David Crowley. And they claimed in this pamphlet that Lincoln and the Republican Party platform advocated interracial marriage as the solution to the racial problems in the nation and a way to achieve racial unity. Now, this wasn't true, but the authors of the text tried to fan the flames of fears that this might provoke in some people for white readers. And this image is just one of many that goes along with that. So to end and bring us more up to date, paradoxically, contemporary images, racialized images of Lincoln, have appeared in our most recent presidential election, in which Barack Obama, an actual biracial candidate, symbolically performed many acts associated with Lincoln. And so, in closing, I want to come full circle before I turn this over to Ed Rollins to talk about contemporary presidents, and invite you to consider, along with me, some of the resonances for you and meanings that come up for you implicit in this contemporary portrait of a blended Abraham Obama, created during Barack Obama's presidential campaign by pop street artist Ron English, who has been interviewed and talking about the advocacy position and his intention in doing this. So in closing, images surround us today as they did our 19th century predecessors. And images of presidents don't just represent or reflect the political personages they depict, they function rhetorically and so help shape the very ways we see them. Thank you.
Having known Lincoln, not having worked for him, one of the few I haven't worked for, I think this is a fascinating subject, and I think that the book that Vanity Fair put out is the epitome of what politics has come to. You have extraordinary visual pictures that most people obviously have never seen, but there's an imagery that come out of those pictures of kind of a young, dynamic president, whoever they may be. You have a one-page, extraordinarily written summary of people's lives, whether they could be 12 years of a presidency or 3 months of a presidency. And as someone that's studied the presidency and had the privilege of working for 4 presidents, as I read this book, I found something new and different about each of the people that were there. And the interesting thing is you can look at the picture and stop there, which many people do. You can read the one page and have some understanding of the 44 presidents that we have served. Or you can go to your magnificent library here and read tons and tons of books and become an expert on the presidency. My job when I function in the course of a campaign or in a White House is to have the imagery back up the substance. And sometimes the substance creates the imagery. People do policy papers in a campaign to show that they're knowledgeable about issues. And when I design a campaign, and I'm not any more brilliant or different than anybody else, I don't have a picture in mind. I don't have a page of writings in mind. I try and think of words that at the end of the campaign, I want the people who are going to vote to think of my candidate. And what I mean by words, obviously leader is always an important word when you think of a president. Compassionate, a candidate of change, a maverick, a rogue, as some of the imageries that came out of this last campaign. But you find 4 or 5 words that describe a very significant quality, and you try and build your imagery around that. A president who cannot communicate in this modern day and age will fail and fail miserably. Certainly in my lifetime, and I always enjoy going to dinner parties in New York City where someone says, "Do you like Sarah Palin?" And I always go, "That's an interesting, I've written columns liking her and not liking her." They said, "Well, she can never be elected president." And I said, "I'm not sure of that. I don't want to sit here and argue the dinner party, but in my lifetime, with the exception of Dwight David Eisenhower, who was an extraordinarily popular president, not very charismatic, not very articulate, but obviously had some extraordinary quality that allowed him to be the supreme Allied commander, running against one of the truly intellects who's ever run. Adlai Stevenson was the governor of Illinois, a man who anytime you heard him speak, you sort of walked away impressed by his knowledge, and an extraordinary candidate. And Eisenhower's slogan was, "I like Ike." And to a certain extent, that word "like" is very important. A candidate will not win if he's not likable. That doesn't mean at the end of the day a president may not be likable or diminished for lack of it. But historically, when it comes down in modern times, you've got to like who you're voting for. And that doesn't have to be only personality, but there's something about them that gives them that quality. Talking about communication and the history of the presidency, the man who was really the great PR master was not my president that I worked for, Ronald Reagan, who was obviously very good, But Teddy Roosevelt, who was one of these historic presidents, everybody asks people, who do you like? Who's your favorite president? Teddy Roosevelt, Democrat, Republican, whatever. I want to be like Teddy Roosevelt. Teddy Roosevelt was the most popular man in his presidency, in his post-presidency. And what people don't realize, unless you're a historian, is that every week, this was in the beginning of the 1900s, 55 million people out of 90 million people went to the movie theaters. Saturday and Sunday, everybody went to the movies. They were in their infancy. Teddy Roosevelt did a PR film. Every week there was a 20-minute film that ran at the end of the double feature. My Week in the White House. And here's Teddy lifting weights, Teddy riding horses, Teddy doing this, Teddy doing that. And everyone walked out of that theater not talking about the great movie stars that they had watched, but our great president. What an extraordinary thing that he did. Now, you think about that today, Obama obviously is on television every moment of every day. With all the multiple medias that we have, you almost have to do that. But if you imagine you walked into a movie theater to see Brad Pitt, and at the end of it you had a 20-minute segment from maybe sometimes it would be better than the movie, but at the end of the day, he was very focused on image. Ronald Reagan, when he first was running for office, when he was running for governor of California, the first guy he hired was a very dear friend of mine, a man named Lynn Hofstra. Lynn was an old newspaper guy, had never been involved in politics, and Reagan called him up and basically said, I want to talk to you. I'm thinking about running for governor. This is before he talked to any political consultant or anything else. And he was the first hire. And Hofstra said to Reagan one day, well, why are you hiring me? Why aren't you hiring a campaign manager? Why aren't you hiring a strategist? Why aren't you hiring someone? He said, Hollywood, the first person you hire is your PR person. And it sounds strange, and people like to sort of think of Reagan only. I tell every candidate that comes to me to ask for counsel, where can I get a good campaign manager? I said, the first thing you need to do is go get a good press person. Because the moment you start as a candidate, you start saying things, and if you don't basically say them properly, you need a good press person to go out and correct them, remember all the rest of those kinds of things. The difference in your life and my life, with the exception of our great president here, is our lives are pretty private. And we can sort of control the elements of them, and we can control the impressions and the images to a certain extent. A president and a candidate running for the presidency is in an environment where he can't control that element. There are so many forces at play. There's your opposition, there's your primary opposition, there's a historic record where people go and look at every element of it. And to a certain extent, as you attempt to drive your message, to say, draw a line across this room that's your message, there's all sorts of people trying to pull it down, change it, alter it, push it this way, push it that way, get you off message. So the premise of staying on message is very, very important. Healthcare was the perfect example. The healthcare message for one solid year, people who are interested in healthcare and people who are not interested in healthcare were bombarded with the messages out there. It wasn't until the end, and the impressions, the images were all different. Very little image of Nancy Pelosi very effectively going behind closed doors, taking some very powerful members of Congress, coming up with a health care bill, passing it very quickly early last year. But the final images of the health care bill were Harry Reid trying to get that 60th vote, going behind closed doors, making deals, deals that nobody else had. So the impression was that something wrong with the process. And then the idea of a 2,000-page bill that most members of Congress who voted on it had no idea what was in it. It was very easy to play as the opponent or the proponent with the concepts of it. So when you run a presidential campaign, you want to take the strengths of the person that you have. You couldn't take someone like Richard Nixon and make him good on television. But Richard Nixon was a man who was surrounded by PR people. All the people who were his principal staff people were PR people. They all came out of Walter Thompson Advertising, Bob Haldeman, Ehrlichman, all these people. And what he created was the advanced operation. It used to be advanced people would go out and do the local logistics with a police department or where you were going to go and talk to the local mayor. They went out and created an environment. They created the flags and all the rest of it, the visuals, which became very, very powerful. And every president since then. And he obviously saw Kennedy do that when he lost to Kennedy, who was a very charismatic, very good on television in its infancy. And all of you are young here who don't remember when television wasn't there. but television was in its infancy on the Kennedy administration, and Kennedy was very good. You had no idea that this was a very crippled man, that this was a man with a very bad back, a man who couldn't be dynamic. You had this image of Kennedy as a very able, smart, capable guy, where Nixon, who basically, who had actually tried to play college football, was a very smart legal scholar, couldn't compete in that environment. So when he became president, he tried to use imagery. The imagery, I mean, it's not all about imagery alone in the sense of it being something false or something that's not real. I mean, an example I'll use is that when I ran Reagan's campaign, I wanted a second-term agenda. I had been in the White House. I left to go out. I argued very strenuously that we needed to have a second-term agenda. We'd pretty much used up the items that we wanted that we'd run on in 1980. And obviously to survive in the next, I'm going to go out and try and win a campaign and argue that in the course of the campaign. The problem was the people of substance in the White House, Jim Baker and Dave Stockton and Dick Darman, knew that the budget numbers were such that you couldn't basically do new things. And so I came up with this brilliant advertising. First of all, I was not going to do advertising. I thought, I took public financing. I didn't have a primary opponent. The first one was public financing, which is no longer ever going to be in existence again. I wanted to use the money I had, the $100 million for the primary and the general, and create organizations around the country and really have a grassroots like Obama had in this last campaign. And I said, I go in and I said, I don't think we need television. We have television. We're on television every single day. NBC, CBS, what have you. Everybody knows who Reagan is. We don't need to go do advertising, what have you. In which a guy named Stu Spencer, who had been Reagan's longtime political guy from California, said, don't forget who your clients are. Your clients, the campaign, is not grassroots organization. Your clients, it's about television. When they see the commercials, then they'll know you have a good campaign, and they weren't very happy with the 80 campaign. So I went out and hired the best advertising guys in the world. I took an all-star team from New York and California. I said, I want you guys to create the best ads possible. And I had a totally different premise than most people have. I said, spend as much money as you need to produce these. I want these to be well produced. Historically, and I had a guy named Roger Enrico who had done the Pepsi commercials. And Roger Enrico's premise was, I would rather have you watch my commercial one time and remember it, and want to watch it a second time than see it 40 times. And he did the Michael Jackson commercials and all the various great Pepsi commercials. That was unheard of in political campaigns. Political campaigns build them cheap, run them as many times as you can so that you're saturated at the end. So I put this all-star team together, and I had this brilliant idea that we were going to have, and I presented to these guys, and they came back with the ads, and I went to the White House, and it was that our biggest accomplishment in the first term was we had rebuilt the military, which was very, very important at that point in time in the post-Vietnam era. And it was basically what we wanted to do in the second term was bring the Soviets to their knees militarily. So we had this great commercial in which you see this ocean scene. You see the great, beautiful day in the background, and you see a bunch of young men in shorts jumping up and down playing volleyball. And the scene pulls back, and it's an aircraft carrier. And they're young sailors playing volleyball. And the tagline is, thank you, Mr. President, we're now prepared for peace. Did the same thing with the softball game. Pull back, tanks are on the side, and these guys are playing softball. Thank you, Mr. President, we're now prepared for peace. Very powerful message. I bring it to the White House, think I'm brilliant, think I have a brilliant team. Mrs. Reagan says, well, we don't want to talk about defense. That's terrible. We don't want to advocate. We don't want people to think he's a warmonger. We want to talk about good things. So that's how we came up with Morning Again in America, which was kind of really pretty commercials. But the tagline on that was leadership you can trust. And I spent $85 million driving a leader you can trust. And when people voted for Ronald Reagan and you asked them why, he was a leader you can trust. Images are very, very important, but you have to sometimes move away from images, and sometimes the substance is very important. And the reality, the great thing about history and political science and what have you, is you can go back and you can look at a presidency and you can measure it. As we talked earlier about Eisenhower. Eisenhower was a beloved president when he was president, won 2 massive landslides. I don't think anybody in 1960 would basically argue that he had been a great president. As people have looked back on the accomplishments of the Eisenhower presidency, it's pretty significant. More important than that was his predecessor, Harry Truman, who was a totally dismissed president in his lifetime. Not any great image, had won He had taken over from Roosevelt, won in a total fluke election in which Dewey was stopped campaigning 3 weeks out and was picking his cabinet. He was going to win by a landslide. Obviously, Truman won in 48. 52, he could not run for re-election. At the end of the day, at the end of his presidency, he was a diminished president who had no money and went back home to independence. Now, historians have gone and reviewed and assessed his presidency, and 25, 30 years later, he's now viewed as one of the great presidencies. So the imagery of a presidency today is so important, and I'll just close with one more story. The morning in America was the flags, the blending, and the premise was things are better. Why would you want to go back to what Jimmy Carter and Walter Mondale had done? It's not that you don't have to go to work, and it's not that things are perfect, but things are better. It's morning again in America is the premise. They were beautifully produced, and they're still used as models. The reality was that the contrast between Reagan and Carter, Mondale, or anybody, Reagan won in 1980 because he wasn't Jimmy Carter, and the country was ready to turn the page. Barack Obama won in this past election not because he ran a brilliant campaign, which he did, probably the best campaign I've ever seen in my lifetime, but people had a Bush fatigue and were very anxious to turn the page. It was Hillary Clinton. I think she would have won the presidency equally as easy. But the imagery and the problem that you face today is there's so many things coming at you. It's hard to drive your message alone. We used to basically say, all right, as a guy who started his life as a boxer, you have to win the rounds in order to win the fight. And I always say in campaigns, you have to win the week. You win the week, then it basically adds up to a period of time that you win the battle. We always tried to win the week. Now, our opponents were the media. They were not in our mind. They're going to try and tell a story that's different than the story we want to tell. They're not going to take our PR press releases. They're not going to take the things we put out there. They're going to basically tell the way they see the story. And what we try to do is stay very consistent, stay on a message. And a perfect example was testing themes for 84. I wanted to try out education. Everything was economic in the first term. We were in a disastrous condition. We had unemployment as high as we have today, even higher. And what I basically tried to do was find out what was bothering Americans. What was bothering Americans was their kids weren't getting as good an education as they were. What had the Reagan administration done? We wanted to abolish the Department of Education. That's all anybody realized us. So I took Reagan, I sent him on the trail for 6 weeks, and all we talked about every single day was education. How can we reform curriculum? How can we do that? And I'll never forget Sam Donaldson, who was covering for ABC, was the correspondent, said to me, I am not going to do one more education speech. I said, do you think I care? That means you're not going to be on the air tonight, and Leslie Stahl of CBS will do the education speech, and Chris Wallace will do the education speech. So we have 2 out of the 3, and you'll have nothing. The next day, Sam led with his education piece. My point is we were able to drive a message. It's much harder today to drive a message. First of all, the New York Times and the Washington Post don't have the clout they had. The 3 networks obviously don't have the clout of the audience, and you've got so many other entities out there that it's very, very difficult to basically drive a message. And I think as we open this up, controlling that message and what you do with it is very important. I had an adventure, is about all I can call it today. I went off and tried to run Ross Perot's, the Tea Party of 1992. I was Ross Perot's campaign manager for 6 weeks. And I gave him this little lecture about how you had 2 parties that were going to try and drive you off your message, that you had to be the candidate of hope. Everybody was going to try and make you to be a kook. And I said, the way to remind yourself is I want you to take a piece of adhesive tape, and I want you to write hope, and I want you to write kook. And I want you to put that on your mirror, and every day when you're shaving, look. I got to be the candidate of hope. I got to be the candidate of not be, let him be a geek. I never knew he was going to take the tape with kook and put it right on his forehead and march out. But at the end of the day, the first time he got attacked by the media, he got totally off message. Staying on message, and one of the advantages of this president, who is still in his infancy, is he wants to be loved, but he also basically can go within himself. And I think to a certain extent, there's enough inner confidence that how his imagery plays out is going to be very fascinating, but more important, how the substance is going to play out is going to be very fascinating. But I think in a period of 2 or 3 weeks now, he has totally reversed the image of someone who wasn't a very strong leader to where people today are saying, maybe we misjudged him, and obviously that's something that you have to do throughout your presidency. One of the things that I won't take any more time on, a post-presidency is also very important about imagery. I mean, Jimmy Carter went out, one of the most dismissed presidents in history. For a period of time, with his Humanity for Habitat and what have you, he sort of reversed that. When he got involved in foreign policy to a point where Clinton and no one else wanted to send him out on those missions because he was uncontrollable, he may have diminished it somewhat. But the whole idea of a post-presidency and how you define yourself is a whole new part of the political process. Thank you. Sorry, I went on.
Thank you. We have time. I'll open it for audience questions in a few moments, but I wanted to start with a question for the panel about the how images of American presidents have evolved throughout history, particularly with changes in technology. Mark, if we could begin with you, and we were speaking earlier today when you met with my presidency class about how you developed these profiles of each of the presidents and the challenges of finding pictures of the presidents or footage of the presidents from which to develop them. If you could say a few words about it, just how you developed the illustrations, and then maybe from the other panelists, if I could ask each of you to speak about how technology has changed the way both the White House strategizes or develops its images of the presidency, as well as how the public today views the president.
My original intention to do the portraits was to do almost a medical drawing of these guys. No spin on them, no agenda attached to them, just let's see what these guys were as men. And when I first started it, again, the idea occurred to me while I was on a walk, and I walked back to my studio. I said, I wonder if this is going to be a hard project. And in my studio, I found 11 of them, including Coolidge and Millard Fillmore. I went, well, if I can find Millard Fillmore in 10 minutes, this is going to be an easy job. 8 years later, I'm still looking for Herbert Hoover. And because what originally occurred to me was, surely people in the White House are thinking ahead that let's take a stock photograph of everybody, because eventually maybe one of these guys is going to be on a coin, and we're going to need that image. Well, it turns out they weren't thinking ahead. So, and the other bizarre thing was, it was sort of a coin flip when I first started drawing them. Should I have them facing this way or this way? I think it's mentioned in the book that I went, well, facing right is a positive image because we read from left to right, and going in this direction always seems to be a positive move. It's always a forward advancement. So I decided to go in that direction, and that's when I realized none of these guys had ever taken a picture facing that direction. So what I then had to do is I found a picture of John Kennedy facing this way, and then I would have to go to rent a film of him to find out what his hair looks like from the other side. And so I spent a lot of time looking at images, and I've now given enough anecdotes I've actually forgotten the question. But that's where it all started. And when I started doing them, I had no idea what I was going to be doing with these drawings. It was fortunate that the art director, I was having lunch with him at Vanity Fair. I said, this might be a little interesting feature. I've got some quotes of what each guy said about the guy before him. And somehow people at Vanity Fair took what was a bizarre little kind of sketchbook and turned it into this, which was okay with me. I had a nice luncheon today. So.
But I mean, I think, as we saw from the pictures of Lincoln, image has always been an essential part of leadership. And the Romans put emperors in profile on coins as signs of authority. We didn't do that until 1909, when Teddy Roosevelt decided Lincoln should be on the penny. And Lincoln was actually the first president to be represented on a coin because it was seen as a kind of an undemocratic thing to do. My late New York Times colleague, Bill Safar, once told me that George Washington himself was almost always, by virtue of his height, the tallest person in the room. and he stood out. He was sort of literally head and shoulders above his colleagues. The thing that has happened so radically, of course, in the 20th century with the advent first of sound, or silent movies, and then sound, then television. Each president has exploited that, and the successful ones have exploited it, to their advantage. And one of my favorite stories actually involves Ed, and I once heard him and Leslie Stahl of CBS tell this story, so I can tell the first half, I think, and maybe Ed can tell the second half. But Leslie, when she was covering the Reagan, it was the re-election campaign of 1984, and she did, for the evening news of that time, a very long, like maybe 3-minute or 5 minutes apiece. That was very, in her view, harshly critical of President Reagan's failures to live up to his promises on any number of policy fronts across the board. And this piece ran at great length on the evening news, and Leslie was bracing herself, and she got a call from the White House, and the call told her
how great it was. What she had is she was standing there in front, Reagan was in the background, flags, bands, all the rest of it, fit right in with all the commercials we had, patriotic, love America, what have you, and she's slamming away on them. So she's there to where people just totally toned out her criticism, and we had a 5.5-minute commercial that blended very nicely into our commercials. So we thanked her for the great piece that she had done on us.
And told her that the words didn't matter at all because what really counted was the pictures, and she was shocked to hear this.
Which, by the way, that is now a standard story in textbooks on the American presidency, as those of you in my class know this semester. We were just talking about it before spring break.
But I think, the interesting question about Obama, as Ed raises, when President Clinton was in office, his aides began to notice that people walking through airports, he was so overexposed, he was on television so much, that people walking through airports would pay no attention when they saw the president on the television screen because they were so used to seeing him there, and quite often in undignified settings like after a morning jog in short pants or something. Obama is clearly the most ubiquitous media figure we've ever had as president, and that includes, not only being on every late-night talk show and every Sunday morning show and doing that. Presidents have long done kind of sports-related things, whether it's a congratulatory call to the Super Bowl winner, but I don't really remember a president shooting hoops with anyone ever.
Certainly not making a three-pointer.
No, or could you imagine? The comparable thing would be have Eisenhower putting with Ben Hogan or something like that, and you just can't imagine that they would really have done that. Kennedy was a far better golfer than Eisenhower ever thought of being, but he didn't want people to know it because he wanted them to think of him as being, touch football and vigorous and an agent for change. So I think the Obama administration may be testing the limits of saturation coverage as to what will work or not work, and there's a point at which you become too familiar. And obviously the accessibility of the technology, the president doesn't give a radio address anymore, he gives a web address, which is released on the internet, and you can see the picture yourself in real time. As we know, Hillary Clinton announced her candidacy on the web, online. Obama effectively did the same thing, although they then had ritual, formal things later on. So I think, who knows whether there will be intravenous news conferences in the future or something. I don't mean, but we haven't seen the limits of it, I suspect.
The other thing that person plays a very important role is the press secretary, and obviously Dee Dee did a great job when she was there, and that whole role has changed. Gibbs is a campaign person, and that has never stopped from the campaign. From the jabs he gives to me, the best in my time was Jody Powell. Jody Powell was an insider. He was one of the 2 or 3 most important people around Jimmy Carter. When he spoke, people knew he was going to tell you the truth. He wasn't going to spin you. And this is a business to where you've got very, very smart people covering you. And as I said, they're not going to take your story per se. They want to tell the truth. And if you attempt to mislead them in any way, shape, or form, you are done. You are absolutely done. And I think to a certain extent, not that this administration has done that. It's just but it's that kind of push shove every day, in which there's a tendency in campaigns to make enemies. There's a good side and a bad side. You create contrast. I think the foolishness here of this administration is using the press, who may not have quite the role they did when you were there, or even 10 years ago, as the foil, as opposed to the vehicle to help carry your message across the country.
And just to reiterate that, but from an earlier perspective, that relationship between the press and the presidency is the thing that struck me in all those images of editors of local papers who were so visible and so clearly part of framing Lincoln. And in Matthew Brady's memoirs, he's the photographer who did the beardless Lincoln, he was very proud of the fact that Lincoln attributed his success to Greeley's first coverage of the Cooper Union speech and the photograph. So that sense of what the photograph says, how people read that image, and being able to deploy that is a long trajectory that I think has brought us to where we are.
We have about 12 minutes for questions, so I think we have microphones on either side. Just one point about images in the 21st century. Ed, you wrapped up with talking about how much President Obama's image has changed just in the 16 months, less than 16 months of his presidency. And I'm, as I was looking at my remarks this morning, I reflected on how much things have changed from February, when we were originally scheduling this panel, where it looked like this was a presidency almost in peril, just a month after the Massachusetts Senate election, the special race, to today, where we were having conversations earlier about the challenges that the Obama presidency has ahead, but yet now that there's a very clear policy legacy that the president has been able to follow through on. And so I guess this raises the question for how much weight we can put on day-to-day images of the president. Which ones are the ones that endure, that become part of the president's legacy, and which ones are the ones that are just the daily story?
Sometimes there's little things, as I explained to you in that class. Ronald Reagan got his image in that first year from two things: not the great success of his legislative program, which he passed all of it in that first year. Getting shot, which is not what I recommend for any president, usually doesn't work successfully. But the humor under very trying times gave people a different image of Reagan. Firing the air traffic controllers, which obviously makes all my union friends go crazy when I say that, showed great strength, and that was in August. You could never take those two things away from him: calm under fire and the fact that he was tough enough to stand up. If he's tough enough to stand up to the air traffic controllers, then he was tough enough to stand up to the Russians. And that's the key thing here that's been people have been waiting to see with Obama is he going to be tough enough to stand up to Putin? Is he going to be tough enough to stand up to the Iranian and Afghan leaders that obviously may welcome the challenge, or is he tough enough to sit on that world stage and basically be looked at as a significant leader? And part of the great advantage that he has as a youthful president is he's a dynamic man who can relate to young people. But on the world stage, does he have the presence? And we'll have to wait and see. And there aren't the allies that other American presidents historically have had. There's no Margaret Thatcher there as Reagan had, or a Helmut Kohl. There's no Tony Blair as there was for Bill Clinton. Where it's a little pushing and shoving on the foreign leaders at this point in time, and whether he will basically be able to sit at that table and they all sit there and listen and pay attention and follow his guidance.
Can I just say something about images changing over time? Carl Diegler, a historian, once talked about history not as a landscape that's a frozen image, but as a seascape that keeps changing. And it keeps changing as more is revealed. And I think your example really is illustrative of that. We only can know from the vantage point of a particular moment what we can know, but there's always more information that lets us think back about the previous time very differently as it gets revealed.
But three presidencies were marred by images. The Newsweek cover on George H.W. Bush calling him a wimp finished him. And he wasn't a wimp. I mean, I knew him personally. He was strong as Reagan, but he could never overcome it. There was nothing he could do. And he knew it he was wounded by that story and that cover. I am not a crook. Nixon is an image that's there. I mean, it's
which is forgotten, but he said that at Disney World.
Yeah, right.
So the dayline was, in the New York Times, it was Lake Buena Vista, Florida, but in the Daily News it was Disney World. So.
And I did not have sex with that woman is a lasting legacy, fortunately or unfortunately for Bill Clinton. So those images, and you combine that not just with the ongoing daily barrage of cable television talk shows, the humor today, the depiction, you know, Tina Fey getting a great career back again, and her depiction of Sarah Palin, you know, Palin might have needed another week or two to finish herself off, but that finished her off. And you look back on history, what Saturday Night Live has done, what John's, I mean, the humor, there's always been the political cartoons, which are very effective, but the humor today, particularly among young people who get their news from different sources, has tremendous impact.
Let's open the conversation to questions. Why don't we start on this side? I know that the seminar here all has prepared questions, so if we can go over here. Stephen, wait for the mic.
Hi. For the second part of the discussion, we've been talking more about recent presidencies, how you construct images and things like that. But really, I guess the people who have the ultimate say are the historians. When we talked about Lincoln, that's why we learned so much from Professor Merrill's presentation, because we don't know a lot about what the media said. We know about what historians have said. So I wanted to focus on the book, the profiles book. To what I know you said you're trying to more recapitulate than actually construct images, but to a certain extent, I guess it's inevitable that you do. So I just want to know if you could, to get your comments on that, about actually doing more than just recapitulating what's already there, but actually shaping and constructing our views of the American presidents.
Well, I mean, obviously some have changed over time, and some have stayed remarkably consistent. I mean, when James Buchanan left the presidency, everyone thought his presidency was a colossal failure, and it, to this day, is ranked as one of the most failed presidencies because it was in the period just before the Civil War, and he was widely considered as not having done anything effective to try to stop it. Other presidents at the time who were reviled by large segments of the population, including Lincoln, who thought he would lose the 1864 election at one point that summer before General Sherman won the Battle of Atlanta. I mean, he was really persuaded he would lose and he wrote out the famous letter on the back of a piece of paper and had the cabinet sign it blind, saying that, you know, if he did lose the election, as seemed likely, it would be his job to work with his successor to save the Union between then and the inauguration, because the person who won would have won in a way that guaranteed he could not save it after the inauguration. So, but then there are other presidents like James K. Polk, whose prosecution of the Mexican War made him incredibly controversial at the time, that had been opposed by Lincoln, who was a good Whig. He's regarded by historians today as really the only truly successful one-term president, and, you know, pretty close in the near great category in most surveys as a person who greatly expanded the territory of the country, was an effective, strong leader, really in many ways the last strong president before the Civil War. So I think you do have to be careful that to realize that it can change all the time. And of course, President Truman, as Ed noted, is the last refuge of every president in trouble who points to Truman's, you know, sneaking out of Washington really in humiliation in a way. And certainly President Bush, the second, in his darkest days, thought of Truman. He thought of Lincoln in the summer of 1864, and he, you know, I think he strongly believes his record will be vindicated by history and from the longer term perspective. And, you know, there may well be aspects of it that are. Other presidents who seem very impressive at the time may come to seem much less impressive as time goes by. So what we tried to do in this book was, in some ways, reflect the cumulative weight of the latest historical scholarship together with the contemporary images and together with the contemporary, you know, reflections, press accounts, and so forth, to make a kind of composite. But I think the point that it's a seascape and not a landscape, or it's a river and not a sidewalk, is very well taken.
The real question mark is going to be not will there be historians, but will there be books?
Yes.
Over here.
Kate? Oh, there's one right behind you.
Thank you. Given the weight that Dr. Merrill has attributed to the art of the newspaper and the political comic, I have a question regarding that image. Is that the cover of the book?
Yes, of the presidential profiles book.
Okay. Given given the lack of prior thought to covers that that Mr. Summers spoke to, as well as Mr. Purdum, I'm curious, aside from the obvious firsts that are depicted there, was there other imagery considered, other effects of the imagery considered when it was chosen as the cover of the book?
Oh, you mean first and last, like having the book?
Well, you have the first president of the United States and the first African-American president of the United States. Clearly, there were other elements considered.
It's showing first and last.
First and last.
It's got nothing to do with Obama's race. It's showing the 43 people.
I see.
That have been. So it's on the.
The question was prompted by your observation about having to, at the last minute, consider in the book the fact that he'd won the Nobel Prize, and so his CV as president was so short. I wondered if there were other things considered other than his CV for another face on the cover of the book.
David, was there? I think this is as simple as alpha and omega, but.
The idea was alpha and omega, the first and last. But it was also, we tried it with Lincoln. We did a three. That's another example. We did a Washington, Lincoln, and Obama. But at one point, we thought it would be Washington and McCain. We knew we were going to have a book. We hoped we were going to have a book, but we didn't know if. I never thought that. Was going to be the first and the last.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but Mark, that image is in fact those are your two sketches put together one by. You didn't draw that image.
No, David Harris, the art director at Vanity Fair, took this job on, and I found out about the cover. I got it emailed to me right before it got published, he was playing around with it. He would send me the odd image where at one point there was a long strip going around the book that showed, I think, 10 different presidents. At that point, I had sort of washed my hands of the book like 4 years ago. And he kept emailing me stuff. I said, I'm willing to look at it, but I mean, I spent the money a few years ago. So whatever you do with it, God bless you. And keep me in the loop. But no, I have to admit I was actually very pleased with the way the image turned out. Well, thank you.
Well, on that note, we've delved into the seascape of how presidential images are developed, designed, created, and what their effects, intended or not, may be. I thank you for joining us, and please join me in thanking the panelists for their fine contributions. We do have a book signing going on up here. Mr. Summers will be staying if you are interested in purchasing the Presidential Profiles book. Thank you.